Hey there, night listeners. Tonight we're talking about medieval celebrations, and here's what I want you to imagine. It's 1347, and you just got invited to the Lord's Christmas feast. Your reaction is probably, how wonderful. Mine would be, how do I politely decline without getting executed? Before we dive in, hit like if this sounds intriguing, and subscribe if you enjoy these journeys into historical suffering. Comment with your worst holiday memory. It's going to feel like a luxury resort experience after tonight. Now get settled, turn down those lights, and let's ease into this together. We're about to learn why medieval people approach parties the way we approach extreme sports. The invitation, when fun becomes mandatory. Picture this. It's December 1348, and you're a moderately successful craftsman in a medieval English town when word arrives that Lord Aldrich is hosting his annual Christmas feast. This isn't a casual invitation you can politely decline. It's essentially a feudal summons disguised as hospitality. Your attendance isn't just expected, it's a demonstration of loyalty and social hierarchy that could affect your livelihood, legal standing, and family's future if you handle it wrong. Medieval celebrations weren't voluntary social gatherings, but complex political and economic events wrapped in the disguise of religious observance and community bonding. Every festival, feast, and holiday celebration served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment, demonstrating wealth and power, reinforcing social hierarchies, conducting business negotiations, arranging marriages, settling disputes, and maintaining the delicate web of obligations that held medieval society together. The invitation itself comes through a chain of social intermediaries that reflects the rigid class structure of medieval life. The Lord Steward informs the village reeve, who tells the guildmasters, who inform their members about their expected attendance. You don't receive a nice written invitation, you get verbal instructions about when to appear, what to bring, and how to behave, delivered with the understanding that non-compliance could result in social ostracism or worse. Your preparation for the celebration begins weeks in advance and consumes resources your family can barely afford. You need to provide a gift appropriate to your station, not too expensive, which would seem presumptuous, but not too cheap, which would appear disrespectful. Finding this balance requires careful negotiation with your wife, consultation with neighbours about what they're bringing, and anxiety about whether your offering will be judged adequate by people who control your economic future. The clothing requirements for medieval celebrations created additional financial stress for families already operating on survival margins. You can't appear in your everyday work clothes, that would show disrespect for the occasion and your social superiors, but you also can't dress above your station, which would be seen as presumptuous and potentially seditious. The narrow band of appropriate attire requires investment in clothing you'll wear rarely but judge constantly, creating debt for the privilege of proper social participation. The timing of medieval celebrations often coincided with agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and political needs rather than optimal weather or convenience for attendees. Christmas feast occurred during the coldest, darkest part of winter, when travel was dangerous and food was scarce. Harvest festivals took place when everyone was exhausted from intensive agricultural labour. Wedding celebrations happened when families could afford the expense, regardless of whether guests could easily attend. Your family's economic situation determines not just your gift and clothing, but your role in the celebration's labour. Lower status attendees were expected to help with preparation, serving, and cleanup, while higher status guests enjoyed the festivities. This meant arriving early to work in kitchens, hauling supplies, setting up tables, and performing whatever tasks the hosts assigned, all while maintaining an appropriately cheerful demeanour about your privilege to serve. The social surveillance aspect of medieval celebrations created enormous pressure to perform appropriate behaviour throughout the event. Every gesture, comment, and interaction would be observed and interpreted by people whose opinions could affect your future prospects. Laugh too loudly and you're crude. Remain too serious and you're antisocial. Drink too much and you're dissolute. Drink too little and you're suspicious. The margin for error was tiny, and the consequences for social missteps could last for years. Women's participation in medieval celebrations involved additional layers of complexity and danger. Female attendees faced scrutiny about their appearance, behaviour, and interactions with men that could result in reputation damage, affecting their marriage prospects, family honour, and social standing. The celebration environment, with its combination of alcohol, reduced supervision, and holiday licence, created opportunities for sexual assault or harassment that women had limited ability to prevent or address. Children's involvement in medieval celebrations was neither optional nor necessarily pleasant. They served as demonstration of family respectability and future social connections, but they also represented potential disasters waiting to happen. Sick children still had to attend, happened, spreading disease to other families, misbehaving children reflected poorly on parental authority, and the chaotic celebration environment posed numerous dangers to young people who lacked adult judgment about appropriate behaviour. The geographic challenges of attending medieval celebrations were significant, particularly during winter months when most major festivals occurred. Travelling to celebration sites meant navigating muddy or frozen roads, potentially dangerous weather, and the risk of bandits or wild animals who knew that people would be carrying gifts and wearing their best clothing. The journey to and from celebrations often proved more hazardous than the events themselves. The accommodation situation for out-of-town guests at medieval celebrations was often primitive and uncomfortable, with visitors crowded into shared spaces with inadequate bedding, heating, or sanitation facilities. The host's obligation to provide shelter didn't extend to comfort or privacy, meaning that guests might sleep on floors, share beds with strangers, or endure conditions that were worse than their normal living situations at home. The legal implications of declining celebration invitations could be severe, as refusal to attend could be interpreted as disloyalty, antisocial behaviour, or even treasonous rejection of feudal obligations. Lords who felt slighted by non-attendance might retaliate through increased taxes, reduced legal protection, or exclusion from economic opportunities that could affect entire families for generations. The invitation was actually a command that couldn't be safely refused. The preparation stress extended beyond individual families to entire communities, as celebration requirements strained local resources and created competition for materials, services, and social recognition that could generate conflicts lasting long after celebrations ended. Villages might exhaust their food supplies, providing appropriate contributions to celebrations, leaving residents undernourished for months afterward, while maintaining the appearance of prosperity during festive periods. The religious obligations associated with medieval celebrations added another layer of complexity and potential failure, as participants needed to demonstrate appropriate Christian knowledge and devotion through complex liturgical participation, while simultaneously engaging in secular activities that often contradicted Christian teachings. The contradiction between religious requirements and celebration practices created moral confusion that participants struggled to resolve. Arrival, welcome to controlled chaos. Arriving at a medieval celebration meant entering a carefully orchestrated but barely controlled social experiment that combined religious observance, political theatre, economic competition, and potential violence in a volatile mixture that could explode at any moment. The scene that greeted you at Lord Aldrich's manor was designed to overwhelm the senses while reinforcing social hierarchies through every detail of arrangement and protocol. The manor courtyard, filled with people, represented a cross-section of a local society, from wealthy merchants and minor nobles to craftsmen, farmers and servants, all dressed in their finest clothes and trying to navigate complex social protocols while managing their anxiety about saying or doing something wrong. The crowd buzzed with nervous energy as people greeted each other with elaborate displays of courtesy that masked underlying tensions about status, business relationships, and personal grudges. The sensory assault began immediately upon arrival. The smell hit you first, a combination of roasting meat, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, perfumes and oils used to mask body odour, alcohol, and the general mustiness of buildings designed more for defence than comfort. The smoke from cooking fires, torches and braziers created a perpetual haze that stung eyes and throats, while providing inadequate illumination for the crowd trying to navigate social interactions in semi-darkness. The noise level was overwhelming, with conversations in multiple languages and dialects, musicians tuning instruments, servants shouting instructions, dogs barking, horses neighing, and the general chaos of hundreds of people trying to participate in organised festivities that were anything but organised. The acoustic properties of medieval buildings, designed for defence rather than social events, meant that sounds bounced and echoed unpredictably, making conversation difficult and adding to the general confusion. Your first challenge was finding your appropriate place in the social geography of the celebration. The physical layout reflected medieval society's rigid hierarchy, with the most prestigious guests seated closest to the Lord's high table, lesser nobles and wealthy merchants in the middle sections, and craftsmen and farmers relegated to tables near the entrances and service areas. Finding your correct position required reading social cues, observing where people of similar status had seated themselves, and hoping you hadn't inadvertently claimed a spot above your station. The gift-giving ceremony provided the first opportunity for public humiliation or social advancement, depending on how well you judged the appropriate level of generosity and quality. Gifts were presented publicly, allowing everyone to observe and evaluate your offering's appropriateness to your status and relationship with the host. Too expensive suggested pretension, too cheap indicated insinuated disrespect. Too unusual might be interpreted as criticism or even witchcraft. The Lord's greeting ritual required precise execution of courtesy protocols that varied by region, social status, and relationship to the host. You needed to approach at the right moment, bow to the appropriate degree, speak the correct formal phrases, and withdraw with proper deference, all under the observation of people who would judge your performance and whose opinions could affect your standing in the community. Mistakes in courtesy were remembered and discussed long after the celebration ended. The seating arrangements created immediate social tension as people jockeyed for positions that reflected their perceived status, while avoiding conflicts with others who might dispute their claims to particular levels of precedence. Medieval society's complex hierarchy meant that status could be ambiguous. A wealthy merchant might outrank a poor knight economically but not socially, creating situations where multiple people might have legitimate claims to the same level of seating priority. The service began immediately upon arrival, but not service as modern people understand it. Medieval celebration service was performed by the guests themselves as demonstrations of respect, obligation, and social positioning. Lower status attendees served higher status guests, but the specific protocols for who served whom, in what order, and with what level of ceremony required intimate knowledge of local social hierarchies and customs that outsiders could easily get wrong. The alcohol started flowing immediately, but medieval drinking at celebrations wasn't casual social lubrication. It was serious business with complex social and economic implications. The quality and quantity of drink offered reflected the host's wealth and generosity, while guests' consumption patterns were observed and judged as indicators of their social sophistication, self-control, and respect for the occasion. Drinking too much or too little could both be interpreted as social failures. The entertainment began during the arrival period, but medieval entertainment at celebrations wasn't passive observation of professional performers. It was participatory activity that required guests to demonstrate their cultural knowledge, artistic abilities, and social graces through singing, dancing, storytelling, or musical performance. Refusing to participate could be seen as antisocial, while poor performance could become the subject of mockery that lasted long after the celebration ended. The religious observances that opened most medieval celebrations weren't brief ceremonial gestures, but extensive ritual requirements that tested guests' knowledge of appropriate prayers, responses, and behaviours. Medieval Christianity was liturgically complex, with celebration-specific religious elements that required familiarity and participation. Failure to demonstrate proper religious knowledge could raise suspicions about heresy or inadequate Christian devotion. The business transactions that occurred during arrival weren't separate from the celebration, but integral to its social and economic functions. Marriages were negotiated, trade agreements discussed, debts collected, and political alliances formed through conversations that appeared casual but carried significant legal and financial implications. The festive atmosphere didn't suspend normal business relationships. It intensified them by bringing all parties together in circumstances that encouraged important decisions. The security concerns began immediately, as celebrations attracted not only invited guests but also uninvited visitors ranging from beggars and entertainers seeking charity or employment to bandits and thieves who viewed celebrations as opportunities for profitable crime. The crowd and confusion provided cover for criminal activity, while the holiday atmosphere reduced vigilance about personal property and safety. Valuables disappeared, purses were cut, and disputes escalated into violence with alarming regularity. The sanitation situation became apparent immediately upon arrival, as medieval celebration venues had minimal facilities for the basic human needs of large crowds. Chamber pots were scarce and often overflowing, privies were inadequate for the number of users, and the general cleanliness standards were appalling by modern measures. The combination of poor sanitation and crowded conditions created ideal environments for disease transmission that would affect attendees for weeks after celebrations ended. The fire hazards present at medieval celebrations were obvious but largely ignored, as wooden buildings filled with intoxicated people using open flames for lighting and entertainment created conditions for catastrophic fires that could destroy entire communities. Medieval fire safety consisted mainly of hoping that fires wouldn't start rather than having effective systems for preventing or controlling them when they inevitably occurred. The weather exposure that characterized many medieval celebrations added another layer of discomfort and danger, as outdoor activities continued regardless of conditions, while indoor spaces were often inadequately heated or ventilated. Guests might simultaneously freeze from exposure and suffer from smoke inhalation, while attempting to participate in festivities that ignored basic human comfort and safety requirements. The social mapping that occurred during arrival determined relationship dynamics for the entire celebration, as first impressions, initial interactions, and preliminary positioning influenced all subsequent social connections. Mistakes made during arrival could affect business relationships, marriage negotiations, and social standing throughout the celebration and beyond, making the entry period a crucial test of social skills and cultural knowledge. The feast, dining with death, Medieval feasting represented the ultimate intersection of celebration and potential catastrophe, where elaborate food preparation met primitive sanitation, where social hierarchy determined not just where you sat, but what diseases you might contract, and where the night's entertainment could range from musical performances to fatal food poisoning. The Great Hall, where Lord Aldrich's Christmas feast took place, embodied all the dangers and delights of medieval celebration culture, compressed into one overwhelming sensory experience. The dining arrangements reflected medieval society's obsession with social rank in ways that affected everything from the quality of food you received to your likelihood of surviving the meal. The high table, elevated on a dais at the far end of the hall, seated the lord, his family, and the most prestigious guests who enjoyed the best food, served first and at optimal temperature, while lower tables received progressively worse food that had been sitting longer and handled by more potentially contaminated servers. The food preparation for medieval feasts was a logistical nightmare that would horrify modern health inspectors, involving dozens of cooks working in primitive kitchens with no understanding of food safety, temperature control, or cross-contamination prevention. Meat might be butchered hours or days before serving, stored without refrigeration, and prepared by people whose personal hygiene was minimal at best. The elaborate dishes that impressed guests with their complexity and expense were often breeding grounds for the bacteria that would make half the attendees violently ill within days. The serving process created additional opportunities for contamination and social disaster, as food passed through multiple hands between kitchen and table, accumulating whatever diseases the servers might be carrying. Servants with respiratory infections breathed on food, servers with open wounds handled dishes, and the same serving implements were used for multiple courses without cleaning. The medieval understanding of disease transmission was so primitive that obvious sources of contamination were completely ignored. The actual dining experience tested guests' social skills, physical endurance, and digestive fortitude simultaneously. Medieval table manners were elaborate and unforgiving, requiring knowledge of complex protocols for eating, drinking, and conversation that varied by social status and regional custom. Using the wrong utensil, eating in the wrong order, or failing to observe proper courtesy toward other diners could result in social humiliation that damaged reputation and relationships for years. The food itself was often barely edible despite its elaborate presentation, as medieval cooking techniques prioritized appearance and symbolic meaning over actual palatability or nutritional value. Meat was frequently overcooked to demonstrate wealth through waste, heavily spiced to mask spoilage, or prepared in ways that were difficult to digest. Vegetables were often neglected entirely, creating meals that were simultaneously excessive and nutritionally inadequate. The drinking culture at medieval feasts was both central to the social experience and extremely dangerous for participants who lacked experience with strong alcohol or who felt social pressure to drink beyond their capacity. Medieval ale and wine were often stronger than modern equivalents, consumed in quantities that would be considered dangerous today, and mixed with spices or herbs that could interact unpredictably with alcohol to create serious medical emergencies. The entertainment during meals created additional hazards as performers moved through crowded spaces with fire, sharp objects, or trained animals that posed risks to intoxicated guests who might lack normal judgment about maintaining safe distances. Jugglers threw knives over diners' heads, flame eaters performed near wooden structures, and trained bears or other wild animals were brought into halls filled with people who had been drinking for hours. The hygiene situation during medieval feasts was catastrophic by any reasonable standard, with hundreds of people eating, drinking, and celebrating in confined spaces without adequate sanitation facilities, hand-washing opportunities, or waste management systems. Chamber pots overflowed, rush floor coverings became saturated with spilled food and drink, and the general level of cleanliness deteriorated rapidly as the celebration progressed, and guests became increasingly intoxicated. The social dynamics during feasting created constant tension between the convivial atmosphere that celebrations were supposed to foster and the competitive status consciousness that dominated medieval society. Guests were expected to be simultaneously friendly and hierarchically appropriate, generous and economically prudent, entertaining and respectful, balancing acts that became increasingly difficult as alcohol consumption progressed. The medical emergencies that occurred during medieval feasts were handled with treatments that were often worse than the original problems, as medieval medicine's understanding of food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, and other celebration-related health issues was primitive and often counterproductive. Bloodletting was prescribed for digestive problems, purging was recommended for poisoning, and various herbal remedies were administered that could interact dangerously with alcohol or exacerbate existing medical conditions. The duration of medieval feasts tested human endurance in ways that modern partygoers would find incomprehensible, with celebrations lasting 8 to 12 hours of continuous eating, drinking, and socializing that exhausted participants physically, mentally, and emotionally. The expectation was that guests would maintain appropriate behavior and social engagement throughout this extended period, regardless of their physical condition or desire to leave. The cleanup process process began even before the feast ended, as servants attempted to manage the accumulating waste, spilled food, and various bodily fluids that resulted from hours of celebration. The sanitation challenges were enormous, as medieval cleaning techniques were inadequate for the level of contamination created by large-scale feasting, and the same spaces would often be used for sleeping accommodations after the formal dining concluded. The leftover food from medieval feasts presented its own challenges, as elaborate dishes that had been displayed for hours at room temperature became increasingly dangerous to consume, but were often distributed to lower status participants or saved for later meals. The economics of medieval celebration meant that food waste was minimized even when food safety was compromised, leading to widespread illness among people who consumed contaminated leftovers. The social aftermath of medieval feasting began immediately as guests attempted to process their experiences, evaluate their social performance, and deal with the physical consequences of hours of excessive consumption. Reputation damage from inappropriate behavior, business relationship changes from negotiations conducted under the influence, and health problems from contaminated food or excessive drinking could all result from single celebration experiences. The kitchen operations that supported medieval feasts were chaotic and dangerous environments, where untrained workers operated primitive equipment under enormous time pressure while handling large quantities of potentially hazardous materials. Kitchen fires were common, scalding injuries frequent, and food contamination endemic due to poor sanitation practices and inadequate supervision of food preparation processes. The economic implications of medieval feast attendance extended far beyond the cost of gifts and appropriate clothing to include potential liability for damages, medical expenses from celebration-related injuries or illnesses, and lost income from time spent recovering from celebration experiences. The total cost of participating in medieval celebrations often exceeded the apparent expenses by substantial margins when all consequences were considered. The seasonal timing of major medieval feasts created additional challenges, as winter celebrations occurred when food supplies were limited, preservation methods were strained, and nutritional deficiencies were most severe among both hosts and guests. The combination of inadequate nutrition and celebration excess created conditions for serious health problems that could persist throughout the winter months when medical treatment was most limited. The religious significance of medieval feasts created complex moral dilemmas for participants who were simultaneously required to demonstrate Christian piety and engage in activities that violated Christian teachings about temperance, humility, and charity. The contradiction between religious purpose and actual practice created spiritual conflicts that many participants struggled to resolve through confession, penance, or theological rationalization. Entertainment, medieval fun, and games. Emphasis on pain. Medieval entertainment at celebrations bore little resemblance to modern concepts of fun and relaxation, instead representing a complex mix of religious instruction, social competition, physical endurance testing, and barely controlled violence that could turn deadly at any moment. The entertainment at Lord Aldrich's Christmas feast exemplified the medieval approach to celebration amusement, events designed to demonstrate social hierarchies, test personal courage, and provide spectacle that often came at the expense of participants' safety and dignity. The musical performances that opened the evening's entertainment weren't background ambience but demanding social obligations that required active participation from guests who might lack musical ability or knowledge of the expected repertoire. Medieval celebration music was often religious in nature, requiring familiarity with Latin texts and complex musical arrangements that could embarrass participants who were unprepared or who made mistakes in front of socially important audiences. Dancing at medieval celebrations was governed by elaborate rules of precedence, propriety, and social signalling that made modern dance floor anxiety seem trivial by comparison. The order in which people danced, the partners they chose, and the specific steps they performed all carried social meaning that could affect relationships and reputations. Inappropriate dancing partners could suggest adultery, incorrect steps could indicate social pretension, and refusal to dance could be interpreted as antisocial behavior. The storytelling competitions that were popular at medieval celebrations required participants to demonstrate not just narrative ability, but also appropriate moral judgment, religious knowledge, and social awareness through their choice of tales and manner of presentation. Stories that were too secular might suggest insufficient piety, while overly religious tales could seem pretentious. The wrong story at the wrong moment could offend important guests, or reveal inappropriate knowledge of subjects better left unmentioned. The games and contests that provided entertainment at celebrations were often physically dangerous activities that tested participants' courage, skill, and pain tolerance, rather than providing harmless amusement. amusement, wrestling matches could result in serious injuries, drinking contests could cause alcohol poisoning, and various strength competitions could leave participants permanently disabled. The social pressure to participate in these dangerous games was enormous, as refusal could be interpreted as cowardice. The gambling that occurred during celebration entertainment wasn't casual wagering, but serious financial activity that could bankrupt families or create debts that lasted for generations. Medieval gambling games were often rigged in favour of experienced players or hosts who used celebrations as opportunities to extract money from guests who felt social pressure to participate but lacked the knowledge or skill to compete effectively. The dramatic performances staged during medieval celebrations often featured themes of violence, death, and divine judgment that were intended to provide moral instruction but could be genuinely traumatic for audience members, particularly children who were required to attend and observe. Mystery plays depicting biblical scenes included graphic representations of torture, execution, and damnation that were designed to inspire religious fear rather than provide entertainment in any modern sense. The animal entertainment popular at medieval celebrations involved trained bears, bulls, or other dangerous animals that posed real threats to audiences who had been drinking for hours and might lack normal judgment about maintaining safe distances. Bear baiting, bull running, and similar activities regularly resulted in injuries or deaths among spectators, who were encouraged to participate in activities that would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards. The religious observations integrated into celebration entertainment weren't brief ceremonial elements, but extended ritual requirements that tested guests' knowledge of appropriate prayers, responses, and behaviours while they were intoxicated and exhausted from hours of feasting. Medieval Christianity required active participation in complex liturgical activities that could be difficult to perform correctly, even under optimal conditions. The competitive elements woven throughout medieval celebration entertainment created constant opportunities for disputes, violence, and long-term social conflicts that could affect relationships for years after the celebration ended. Competitions over everything from singing ability to physical strength could escalate into serious disputes that involved entire families or social groups, transforming celebratory entertainment into sources of permanent antagonism. The sexual undertones of much medieval celebration entertainment created dangerous situations for women who had limited ability to refuse participation or protect themselves from unwanted attention in environments where alcohol, reduced supervision, and holiday license combined to increase risks of assault or harassment. Games that involved physical contact, dancing that required intimate partnering, and contests that focused on physical attributes all created opportunities for exploitation. The fire-based entertainment popular at medieval celebrations, including flame juggling, fire eating, and elaborate torch displays, presented obvious safety hazards in environments constructed primarily of wood, thatch, and other flammable materials. Medieval buildings had no fire safety systems, limited escape routes, and construction materials that could turn celebrations into deadly infernos within minutes if entertainers made mistakes or if guests knocked over torches while intoxicated. The psychological impact of medieval celebration entertainment was often negative rather than positive, as activities designed to provide amusement frequently involved humiliation, violence, or fear that created lasting trauma rather than pleasant memories. Public mockery of individuals with disabilities, elaborate practical jokes that caused genuine harm, and various forms of ritualized bullying were all considered acceptable entertainment that modern sensibilities would recognize as abuse. The duration of medieval celebration entertainment tested participants' physical and mental endurance beyond reasonable limits, with activities continuing throughout the night and into the following day regardless of guests' fatigue, illness, or desire to leave. The social expectation was that participants would maintain enthusiasm and appropriate behaviour throughout extended periods of celebration that would exhaust modern partygoers within hours. The participation pressure created by medieval celebration entertainment eliminated the concept of voluntary engagement, as guests who attempted to avoid activities could face social ostracism, accusations of antisocial behaviour, or suspicions about their reasons for non-participation. The only acceptable excuse for avoiding dangerous or uncomfortable entertainment was serious illness, and even that might be questioned if the person appeared too healthy or recovered too quickly. The skill requirements for medieval celebration entertainment often exceeded guests' abilities, creating situations where social pressure to participate conflicted with realistic assessments of personal capability. Guests might be expected to sing songs they didn't know, perform dances they hadn't learned, or engage in physical competitions for which they lacked adequate preparation, leading to embarrassing failures that could affect social standing for extended periods. The equipment and facilities used for medieval celebration entertainment were often inadequate for safe participation, with improvised performance spaces, defective implements, and minimal safety precautions creating conditions where accidents were predictable rather than surprising. The lack of proper equipment maintenance, safety inspections, or emergency response plans planning meant that entertainment activities regularly caused preventable injuries and deaths. The weather conditions during medieval celebrations often made entertainment activities more dangerous than they would be under optimal circumstances, as outdoor activities continued regardless of rain, snow, ice, or extreme temperatures, while indoor entertainment occurred in poorly heated, inadequately ventilated, or overcrowded spaces that created additional hazards for participants and observers. The intergenerational aspects of medieval celebration entertainment created particular challenges for families attending celebrations together, as activities that might be appropriate for adults could be traumatic or dangerous for children who were nonetheless expected to observe or participate. The lack of age-appropriate entertainment alternatives meant that families had to choose between exposing children to inappropriate content or excluding them from important social events. Religion and revelry, holy days from hell. Medieval religious celebrations represented a particularly volatile combination of sacred obligation and secular excess, where attempts to honour divine authority collided with human nature in ways that often produced chaos, violence, and behaviour that violated the very religious principles the celebrations were supposed to uphold. The Christmas season at Lord Aldrich's Manor exemplified this contradiction, as Christian observance provided the official framework for festivities that included practices that would have scandalised the religious authorities who mandated the celebrations. The religious requirements that governed medieval celebrations were extensive and unforgiving, demanding participants demonstrate proper Christian knowledge and devotion through complex liturgical participation, while simultaneously engaging in secular activities that often contradicted Christian teachings about temperance, humility, and moral behaviour. Guests were expected to maintain appropriate piety during religious observances, while also participating enthusiastically in drinking, gambling, and other worldly pursuits that formed the social core of celebration culture. The Christmas liturgy that opened the celebration required hours of standing, kneeling, and responding to Latin prayers that many participants didn't understand but were required to perform correctly or face accusations of insufficient Christian devotion. The physical demands of medieval religious observance were significant, particularly for elderly or infirm participants, who nonetheless had to demonstrate their piety through participation in lengthy services conducted in unheated buildings during winter's coldest period. The theological contradictions inherent in medieval celebration culture created cognitive dissonance that participants resolved through various forms of compartmentalization, hypocrisy, or genuine confusion about Christian requirements. The same celebration that began with prayers for divine blessing and spiritual purification would feature gambling, gluttony, sexual misconduct, and violence that directly violated Christian teachings, creating moral confusion that clergy and laypeople struggled to reconcile. The Feast of Fools traditions that accompanied many medieval religious celebrations officially inverted social hierarchies and moral standards in ways that temporarily legitimized behavior that would normally result in severe punishment. Servants mocked masters, religious ceremonies were parodied, and various forms of ritualized chaos were encouraged as part of seasonal tradition, but the boundaries between acceptable inversion and unacceptable rebellion were unclear and could shift without warning. The superstitious practices that permeated medieval religious celebrations combined Christian doctrine with pre-Christian folk traditions in ways that created complex belief systems that clergy officially condemned but couldn't eliminate from popular practice. Celebrations included elements of sympathetic magic, seasonal rituals, and nature worship that coexisted uneasily with Christian theology, creating religious syncretism that satisfied neither pagan nor Christian religious requirements. The moral policing that occurred during religious celebrations was inconsistent and often hypocritical, as behaviour that would normally result in serious punishment might be overlooked during celebrations, while other activities that were normally acceptable might be severely punished if they occurred at the wrong moment or in the wrong context. The shifting standards created anxiety among participants who couldn't predict what behaviour would be considered appropriate. The confession requirements that preceded major religious celebrations created additional stress for participants who were expected to cleanse their souls before engaging in activities that would immediately compromise their spiritual condition again. The cycle of confession, absolution, celebration, sin, and renewed confession created a religious treadmill that highlighted the contradictions inherent in medieval Christian celebration culture. The charitable obligations associated with religious celebrations required participants to demonstrate Christian generosity through gifts to the poor, but the social pressure to provide impressive charity often motivated giving that was more about status display than genuine compassion. The competitive aspects of religious charity corrupted its spiritual purpose while creating additional financial pressure on celebrants who were already spending beyond their means. The pilgrimage elements integrated incorporated into some medieval celebrations required participants to demonstrate religious devotion through physical hardship and spiritual discipline that contrasted sharply with the indulgent aspects of celebration culture. Religious processions conducted in harsh weather, visits to holy sites that required uncomfortable travel, and various forms of religious penance were woven into celebrations that also featured elaborate feasting and entertainment. The heresy concerns that surrounded medieval religious celebrations created an atmosphere of surveillance and suspicion that affected participants' ability to enjoy festivities without worry about theological correctness. Comments that could be interpreted as questioning church doctrine, behaviour that seemed insufficiently pious, or participation in traditional practices that clergy considered too pagan could result in serious religious and legal consequences. The class conflicts that emerged during religious celebrations reflected broader tensions in medieval society about spiritual equality versus social hierarchy, as Christian teachings about universal human dignity conflicted with feudal systems that emphasized rigid class distinctions. Religious celebrations temporarily emphasized spiritual equality while maintaining social distinctions, creating confusion about appropriate behavior and relationships. The gender restrictions that governed religious participation in medieval celebrations limited women's roles while simultaneously making them responsible for much of the preparation and service work that made celebrations possible. Women were excluded from many religious ceremonies, but expected to provide the labour that enabled male participation in activities from which they were barred, creating resentment and tension that affected celebration dynamics. The commercial aspects of medieval religious celebrations created conflicts between spiritual purposes and economic interests, as celebrations became opportunities for trade, debt collection, and business negotiation that corrupted their religious significance. The mixing of sacred and secular interests made religious celebrations venues for activities that had little to do with spiritual observance but were justified through tenuous connections to religious themes. The violence that frequently accompanied medieval religious celebrations contradicted Christian teachings about peace and forgiveness, while being justified through various theological rationalizations about righteous anger, divine justice, or necessary discipline. Religious celebrations regularly featured fights, beatings, and other forms of violence that participants somehow reconciled with their Christian beliefs about appropriate behavior. The sexual misconduct that occurred during medieval religious celebrations violated Christian teachings about chastity and marriage, while being excused through various cultural traditions about seasonal license, marriage customs, or celebration traditions that temporarily suspended normal moral standards. The holiday atmosphere provided cover for sexual activity that would normally be severely punished, creating moral confusion about Christian sexual ethics. The blasphemous elements that appeared in medieval religious celebrations, including parodies of religious ceremonies, mockery of religious figures, and various forms of irreverent humour, were simultaneously condemned by church authorities and tolerated as part of seasonal tradition. The church's inability to eliminate blasphemous celebration traditions revealed the limitations of religious authority and the persistence of popular culture that resisted clerical control. The idolatrous practices that accompanied medieval religious celebrations included veneration of secular symbols, excessive focus on material displays of wealth, and various forms of worship that elevated human achievements above divine authority. The contradiction between Christian teachings about proper worship and the actual focus of celebration activities created theological problems that participants attempted to resolve through various forms of rationalization. The magical thinking that permeated medieval religious celebrations combined Christian beliefs about divine intervention with folk traditions about supernatural causation that created complex systems of belief and practice that satisfied neither rational analysis nor orthodox theology. Celebrations included elements of divination, spellcasting, and various forms of magical practice that coexisted uneasily with official Christian doctrine. Violence and mayhem. When celebrations turned deadly, medieval celebrations had an alarming tendency to escalate into serious violence that left participants injured, dead, or facing legal consequences that could destroy their lives and families. The combination of alcohol, social tensions, competitive activities, weapons, and reduced supervision created perfect conditions for conflicts that began as minor disputes but ended as major tragedies that affected entire communities for years after the celebrations concluded. The alcohol consumption that was central to medieval celebration culture wasn't the controlled social drinking of modern parties, but serious consumption of strong beverages by people who often had limited experience with alcohol and felt social pressure to drink beyond their capacity. Medieval ale and wine were frequently more potent than modern equivalents, consumed in quantities that would be considered dangerous today, and mixed with herbs or spices that could interact unpredictably to increase intoxication or create medical emergencies. The weapons that medieval celebration attendees routinely carried weren't ceremonial decorations, but functional tools and defensive equipment that could become deadly implements during disputes that escalated beyond verbal argument. Knights and nobles wore swords as symbols of status, craftsmen carried knives for work and protection, and even peasants might have agricultural tools that could serve as weapons when conflicts became physical rather than verbal. The social tensions that simmered beneath the surface of medieval celebration culture included economic disputes, political disagreements, family feuds, romantic rivalries, and class conflicts that could explode into violence when participants' normal restraint was reduced by alcohol consumption and holiday atmosphere. Celebrations brought together people who might normally avoid each other, forcing interaction between individuals and groups who had legitimate grievances that could escalate unpredictably. The honour culture that dominated medieval society meant that perceived insults or slights that might be overlooked in modern contexts could trigger violent responses that participants considered necessary to maintain their reputation and social standing. Medieval concepts of masculine honour required physical response to certain types of provocation, creating situations where backing down from confrontation was considered more damaging than engaging in potentially deadly violence. The legal consequences of celebration violence were often less severe than violence committed in other contexts, as holiday traditions and cultural expectations created unofficial tolerance for certain types of aggressive behaviour that would normally result in serious punishment. This legal ambiguity encouraged risk-taking and aggression, while providing inadequate deterrence against behaviour that could cause permanent harm to victims and communities. The group dynamics that developed during medieval celebrations could transform individual disputes into large-scale conflicts that involved entire families, guilds, or social factions in violence that far exceeded the original disagreement's significance. Loyalty obligations and social relationships meant that personal conflicts quickly became group conflicts that could affect dozens or hundreds of people who had no direct involvement in the original dispute. The escape routes and security measures at medieval celebration venues were minimal or non-existent, meaning that when violence erupted, participants had limited ability to avoid involvement or flee to safety. Medieval buildings were designed for defense rather than crowd control, with narrow exits and confusing layouts that could trap people in dangerous situations when panic or violence broke out among large groups of intoxicated celebrants. The medical treatment available for violence-related injuries during medieval celebrations was primitive and often counterproductive, as medieval medicine's understanding of trauma treatment was limited and sometimes harmful. Serious injuries that might be treatable with modern medical intervention could prove fatal when treated with medieval techniques like bloodletting, purging, or various herbal remedies that could worsen patients' conditions. The investigation and prosecution of celebration violence was complicated by the social relationships between participants, witnesses, and authorities, as well as by the difficulty of determining responsibility when multiple people were involved in chaotic situations where reliable witness testimony was hard to obtain. Medieval legal systems were ill-equipped to handle complex cases involving multiple participants who might have legitimate claims of self-defense or justified retaliation. The economic consequences of celebration violence extended far beyond immediate medical costs to include compensation for injuries, fines for legal violations, loss of income due to disability, and potential seizure of property to pay for damages or legal penalties. Violence that began as minor disputes could bankrupt families or destroy livelihoods when legal and economic consequences were fully calculated. The reputation damage that resulted from involvement in celebration violence could affect participants' social standing, business relationships, and marriage prospects for years after the events occurred, as medieval communities had long memories for violent behaviour and strong opinions about appropriate responses to conflict. Even victims of violence might suffer reputation damage if their behaviour was perceived as having contributed to the conflicts that resulted in their injuries. The family feuds that could result from celebration violence often persisted for generations, as injuries, deaths, or other serious consequences created ongoing obligations for revenge or compensation that affected relationships between extended families long after the original participants were dead. Medieval culture's emphasis on family honour and collective responsibility meant that individual conflicts became hereditary disputes that could influence community dynamics for decades. The seasonal patterns of celebration violence reflected broader social and economic stresses that made certain times of year more dangerous for community gatherings, as harvest pressures, winter hardships, religious tensions, and other factors created conditions that made violence more likely during specific celebration periods. Communities learned to expect certain types of problems during particular celebrations while remaining unable to prevent them effectively. The weapons-related injuries that occurred during medieval celebrations were often more severe than modern violence, because medieval weapons were designed for warfare rather than personal protection, creating wounds that were difficult to treat and often fatal even when they didn't initially appear life-threatening. Sword cuts, spear wounds, and injuries from various medieval weapons created medical challenges that exceeded contemporary treatment capabilities. capabilities, the psychological trauma that resulted from witnessing or experiencing celebration violence affected participants long after physical injuries healed, as medieval society provided few resources for addressing mental health consequences of traumatic experiences. The normalization of violence in medieval culture didn't eliminate its psychological impact, but rather made it more difficult for victims to receive appropriate support or understanding for their ongoing emotional distress. The property damage that often accompanied celebration violence included destruction of buildings, furniture, decorations, and personal possessions that represented significant economic losses for hosts and communities who might struggle to recover from the financial impact of violent celebrations. The cost of repairing damage from celebration violence could exceed the original expense of hosting celebrations, creating economic disincentives for future community gatherings. The disruption to ongoing business and social relationships caused by celebration violence could affect community functioning for extended periods, as conflicts that emerged during celebrations continued to influence interactions between individuals and groups long after the original events. The social capital invested in celebrations could be completely destroyed by violent incidents that created permanent divisions within communities. The spillover effects of celebration violence often extended beyond the immediate participants to affect family members, business associates, and community members who had no direct involvement in the original conflicts, but were nonetheless drawn into ongoing disputes through social and economic relationships. The interconnected nature of medieval communities meant that violence affecting any significant number of people could disrupt entire social networks. The seasonal timing of major celebrations meant that violence often occurred during periods when communities were least able to cope with disruption, as winter celebrations happened when resources were strained and medical care was most limited, while harvest celebrations occurred when communities needed maximum cooperation to complete essential agricultural work. The timing of celebration violence could compound its negative effects on community welfare and economic stability. The aftermath. Surviving medieval fun. The conclusion of medieval celebrations didn't mark the end of their impact, but rather the beginning of a complex aftermath period that could last for months or years as participants dealt with the physical, social and economic consequences of their festive experiences. The morning after Lord Aldrich's Christmas feast brought harsh reality in the form of hangovers, illness, social embarrassment, financial obligations, and various forms of damage that required lengthy recovery processes. The physical recovery from medieval celebrations was often prolonged and sometimes incomplete, as participants dealt with injuries from accidents or violence, illness from contaminated food or excessive drinking, and general exhaustion from days of inadequate sleep and excessive stimulation. Medieval medicine's limited understanding of recovery processes meant that celebration-related health problems were often treated with remedies that prolonged suffering rather than providing effective relief. The social consequences of medieval celebration behaviour became apparent in the days and weeks following events, as participants discovered how their actions, words, and associations during celebrations had affected their relationships, reputation, and standing in the community. Comments made while intoxicated, partnerships formed during dancing, and various social interactions that seemed harmless during celebrations could have lasting implications for business relationships, marriage prospects, and community acceptance. The economic aftermath of medieval celebrations included not just the immediate costs of gifts, clothing, and travel, but also ongoing financial obligations created during celebrations through gambling debts, business agreements negotiated while intoxicated, charitable commitments made publicly, and various other financial commitments that participants might not clearly remember making, but were nonetheless legally and socially binding. The legal consequences of celebration behaviour could emerge weeks or months after events, as authorities investigated complaints about violence, theft, adultery, heresy, or other offences that occurred during celebrations. Medieval legal systems moved slowly, and participants might face prosecution for celebration activities long after they had assumed the events were concluded and forgotten by authorities and community members. The health impacts of medieval celebrations extended beyond immediate injuries or illness to include long-term consequences of malnutrition, alcohol abuse, exposure to infectious diseases, and various forms of physical stress that could affect participants' well-being for months or years after celebrations ended. The cumulative effect of multiple celebrations could create chronic health problems that medieval medicine was unable to address effectively. The family relationships affected by medieval celebration behaviour required ongoing management and repair, as conflicts between family members, inappropriate behaviour by spouses, and various social embarrassments could create domestic tensions that persisted long after the celebrations that caused them. Medieval families were extended networks of economic and social relationships that could be damaged by individual members' celebration celebration behaviour. The business relationships formed or damaged during medieval celebrations had lasting implications for participants' economic prospects, as partnerships negotiated while intoxicated, disputes arising from celebration conflicts, and various forms of social networking that occurred during events could affect trade relationships, employment opportunities, and financial security for years after celebrations concluded. The religious consequences of medieval celebration behaviour required attention from clergy and penitential systems that addressed spiritual damage caused by excessive drinking, sexual misconduct, violence, gambling, and various other activities that violated Christian moral teachings, despite occurring during religiously sanctioned celebrations. The contradiction between celebration license and religious requirements created ongoing spiritual conflicts for participants. The reputation management required after medieval celebrations was a complex and ongoing process, as participants attempted to minimize damage from embarrassing behavior while maximizing benefits from positive social interactions that occurred during events. Medieval society's emphasis on honor and reputation meant that celebration behavior could affect social standing for years, requiring careful attention to community perceptions and relationship maintenance. The recovery processes for medieval celebration injuries were lengthy and often incomplete, as medical treatment was limited and rehabilitation resources were non-existent. Participants who suffered serious injuries during celebrations might face permanent disability that affected their ability to work, support their families, and participate in future social activities, creating long-term consequences that extended far beyond the celebration period. The community impact of medieval celebrations included both positive and negative effects that influenced local social dynamics, economic relationships, and political arrangements for months or years after events concluded. Successful celebrations could strengthen community bonds and economic networks, while problematic celebrations could create divisions and conflicts that affected community functioning and cooperation. The seasonal cycle of medieval celebrations meant that participants had limited time to recover from one celebration before preparing for the next, creating cumulative physical, social, and economic stress that could become overwhelming for individuals and families who participated in multiple celebrations throughout the year. The celebration calendar was dense with religious and secular events that required ongoing preparation and participation. The memory management required after medieval celebrations involved complex social negotiations about which events would be remembered, discussed, and potentially prosecuted, and which would be forgotten, forgiven, or overlooked in the interest of community harmony. Medieval communities had to balance accountability for celebration misconduct with the practical need to maintain social relationships and economic cooperation. The learning process that resulted from medieval celebration experiences was often costly and sometimes incomplete, as participants attempted to modify their behavior to avoid repeating mistakes while maintaining their social standing and celebration participation. The complex social requirements of medieval celebrations made it difficult to learn appropriate behavior without experiencing negative consequences from inappropriate actions. The debt collection that followed medieval celebrations could continue for months or years after events, as creditors pursued payment for goods and services provided during celebrations, gambling debts incurred during festivities, and various financial obligations that participants had assumed while intoxicated. Medieval debt collection practices were often harsh and could result in imprisonment, seizure of property, or forced labour for people unable to meet their financial obligations. The marriage negotiations that began during medieval celebrations often required extended follow-up discussions and formal arrangements that could take months to complete, while involving complex negotiations about dowries, property rights, family alliances, and social obligations. The social connections made during celebrations provided starting points for serious life decisions that required careful consideration and formal arrangements extending far beyond the festive period. The legal documentation required after medieval celebrations included contracts for business agreements, marriage arrangements, property transfers, and various other formal agreements that had been negotiated during celebrations but required written documentation and official approval. The legal process for formalizing celebration agreements could be complex and expensive, requiring additional time and resources from participants who might already be strained by celebration expenses. The religious penance required after medieval celebrations could include fasting, prayer, charitable donations, pilgrimage, or other forms of spiritual discipline designed to address sins committed during celebrations. The penitential process could extend for weeks or months after celebrations, creating ongoing religious obligations that affected participants' daily lives and spiritual practices long after the festive period concluded. Disease and contagion, the deadly gift that keeps giving. One of the most insidious aspects of medieval celebrations was their function as disease transmission centres, where hundreds of people from different communities gathered in crowded, unsanitary conditions to share food, drink, breath and bodily fluids in ways that created perfect environments for epidemic disease to spread throughout entire regions. The weeks following major celebrations regularly saw outbreaks of plague, dysentery, influenza and various other infectious diseases that could kill more people than had attended the original festivities. The respiratory diseases that spread through medieval celebration crowds were particularly devastating because they transmitted easily through the air in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces where people were breathing, talking, singing and coughing in close proximity for extended periods. Tuberculosis, pneumonia and various forms of lung fever found ideal conditions at celebrations where hundreds of people shared the same air while participating in activities that increased respiratory activity and disease transmission. The gastrointestinal diseases that resulted from medieval celebration food and water contamination could affect entire communities for weeks after celebrations ended, as contaminated food sources, poor sanitation practices and inadequate waste management created conditions for dysentery, cholera and various other waterborne pathogens to spread throughout celebration attendees and their families. The long incubation periods for many of these diseases meant that people could return home feeling healthy while carrying infections that would soon make them and their communities seriously ill. The skin diseases that spread through medieval celebrations included scabies, lice infestations and various fungal infections that transmitted through physical contact, shared bedding and crowded living conditions during multi-day celebrations. These conditions might seem minor compared to life-threatening diseases, but they created chronic discomfort and social stigma that could affect victims for months while continuing to spread through communities long after celebrations ended. The sexually transmitted diseases that spread through medieval celebrations were a predictable consequence of events that combined alcohol consumption, reduced supervision and social license in ways that increased sexual activity while providing no protection against disease transmission. Syphilis, gonorrhea and various other infections spread through celebration populations and then into broader communities through ongoing sexual relationships, creating epidemic patterns that could affect entire regions. The childhood diseases that spread at medieval celebrations were particularly tragic because entire families often attended celebrations together, meaning that diseases like measles, mumps or whooping cough could spread from celebration sites throughout communities to affect every household with young children. The vulnerability of medieval children to infectious diseases meant that celebration-related epidemics regularly caused high childhood mortality rates in communities that had hosted or attended festivities. The plague transmission that occurred during medieval celebrations created some of history's most devastating epidemic patterns, as bubonic plague could spread from a single celebration to affect entire regions through the networks of trade, travel, and social connection that celebrations facilitated. The timing of major celebrations during plague seasons created conditions where religious and secular festivities became inadvertent mechanisms for disease transmission that could depopulate entire communities. The seasonal timing of major medieval celebrations coincided with periods when disease transmission was most likely and treatment was most limited, as winter celebrations occurred when people's resistance was lowest due to malnutrition and cold exposure, while harvest celebrations happened when people were exhausted from agricultural labour and most vulnerable to infectious diseases. The celebration calendar seemed designed to maximise disease transmission during periods when communities were least able to cope with epidemic illness. The medical treatment available for celebration-related diseases was not only ineffective but often harmful, as medieval physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, and various toxic substances that weakened patients' natural resistance while failing to address the underlying infections. The medical intervention that followed celebration-related disease outbreaks often killed more people than the diseases themselves would have claimed if left untreated. The quarantine measures available for celebration-related disease outbreaks were minimal and often ineffective, as medieval communities lacked understanding of disease transmission patterns and had limited ability to isolate infected individuals or communities. The social and economic connections created by celebrations made it nearly impossible to prevent disease spread once epidemics began, as people continued to travel and interact despite obvious signs of epidemic illness. The economic impact of celebration-related disease outbreaks extended far beyond medical expenses to include lost productivity, disrupted trade relationships, and reduced agricultural output in communities affected by epidemic illness. The timing of disease outbreaks following harvest celebrations could be particularly devastating, as communities might lose their agricultural workforce just when they needed maximum labour to preserve food supplies for winter survival. The social impact of celebration-related disease outbreaks included breakdown of normal community relationships, as fear of contagion made people reluctant to provide care for sick neighbours, participate in community community activities or maintain normal social connections. The social capital built through celebrations could be completely destroyed by epidemic diseases that made community cooperation impossible due to fear of infection. The long-term demographic effects of celebration-related disease outbreaks could affect community viability for generations, as high mortality rates among adults in their prime working years created labour shortages, disrupted family structures, and reduced reproductive capacity in ways that permanently altered community composition and economic prospects. Some communities never recovered from epidemic diseases that originated at seasonal celebrations. The psychological impact of celebration-related disease outbreaks created lasting trauma for survivors who associated social gatherings with death and disease, making it difficult for communities to resume normal celebration practices even after immediate epidemic threats had passed. The cultural memory of celebration-related epidemics could influence community attitudes towards social gatherings for decades, creating permanent changes in local customs and traditions. The religious interpretation of celebration-related disease outbreaks often focused on divine punishment for excessive celebration, creating theological conflicts between the religious purposes of celebrations and the epidemic consequences that followed them. Some communities abandoned traditional celebrations entirely after experiencing severe disease outbreaks, while others modified their practices to reduce disease transmission risks while maintaining religious observances. The regional spread of celebration-related diseases followed patterns of social and economic connection that linked communities through trade relationships, family networks, and religious affiliations. Major celebrations could serve as epidemic starting points that spread diseases across entire regions through the networks of connection that made celebrations possible, creating pandemic patterns that affected vast areas of medieval Europe. The seasonal cycles of celebration-related disease outbreaks created predictable patterns of epidemic illness that communities learned to anticipate but remained unable to prevent effectively. The knowledge that celebrations regularly caused disease outbreaks didn't lead to significant changes in celebration practices, but rather to fatalistic acceptance of epidemic disease as an inevitable consequence of social gathering and religious observance. Child suffering. When fun becomes trauma. The participation of children in medieval celebrations created particular forms of suffering and trauma that affected young people's physical health, psychological development, and social relationships in ways that could influence their entire life trajectories. Children weren't passive observers of adult celebration culture, but were expected to participate actively in activities that were often inappropriate, dangerous, or psychologically damaging for young people who lacked the cognitive and emotional resources to cope with adult forms of entertainment and social interaction. The physical dangers that children faced at medieval celebrations were enormous and largely ignored by adults who were focused on their own social obligations and entertainment rather than child safety. Children were exposed to the same contaminated food, excessive alcohol, dangerous entertainment, and violent conflicts as adults, but with less physical resilience, poorer judgment about risk assessment, and no authority to remove themselves from dangerous situations when adults decided their participation was required. The psychological trauma that children experienced at medieval celebrations included exposure to graphic violence, sexual content, religious imagery designed to inspire terror, and various forms of adult behaviour that could be genuinely frightening for young people who didn't understand the social context that made such behaviour acceptable to adult participants. Medieval celebrations regularly featured content that modern child protection services would consider abusive if children were deliberately exposed to it. The educational aspects of medieval celebrations were often traumatic rather than beneficial, as children were expected to learn about religious concepts like divine judgment, eternal damnation, and physical suffering through exposure to graphic imagery and dramatic presentations that could create lasting psychological disturbance. The pedagogical theory that children learned through fear meant that celebration education was designed to be psychologically disturbing rather than age-appropriate. The social expectations placed on children during medieval celebrations required performance of adult behaviours and knowledge that exceeded their developmental capabilities, creating situations where children were set up for failure and public humiliation when they couldn't meet unrealistic expectations for social sophistication, religious knowledge, or cultural performance. The pressure on children to perform appropriately in adult social contexts could create lasting anxiety about social interaction and public performance. The medical risks that children faced at medieval celebrations were compounded by their physical vulnerability and the absence of pediatric medical knowledge that could address their specific health needs. Children were more susceptible to food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, infectious diseases, and various other health problems common at celebrations, but medieval medicine made no distinction between adult and child patients when treating celebration-related illness and injury. The supervision arrangements for children at medieval celebrations were minimal and often ineffective, effective, as adults were typically too intoxicated, distracted, or occupied with their own social obligations to provide adequate oversight of children's safety and behaviour. Children might be left largely unsupervised in dangerous environments, while adults assumed that other family members or community members were watching them, creating situations where serious harm could occur without adult intervention. The sleep disruption that affected children during medieval celebrations was severe and could affect their physical and psychological development, as celebration schedules ignored children's need for adequate rest, while expecting them to participate in activities that continued throughout the night and into the following day. The combination of overstimulation and sleep deprivation could create behavioural and health problems that persisted long after celebrations ended. The nutritional impact of medieval celebrations on children was often negative rather than positive. The celebration foods were typically too rich, too highly spiced, or too contaminated for children's digestive systems, while the disruption to normal meal schedules could create nutritional deficiencies that affected growth and development. Children might become seriously ill from eating celebration foods that adults could tolerate, but their symptoms were often dismissed as normal consequences of festive excess. The moral confusion that children experienced during medieval celebrations resulted from exposure to adult behaviours that contradicted the moral teachings they received during normal times, creating cognitive dissonance that children lacked the intellectual resources to resolve effectively. The contradiction between Christian moral instruction and actual adult behaviour at religious celebrations could create lasting confusion about moral standards and religious authority. The family dynamics that affected children during medieval celebrations were often stressful and sometimes traumatic, as the pressure on families to perform appropriately at social events could create tension, conflict, and dysfunction that children experienced directly but couldn't understand or control. Family disputes that emerged during celebrations could affect children's sense of security and family stability long after the celebrations that triggered them. The class consciousness that children developed through participation in medieval celebrations could create lasting psychological damage for young people who learned their social subordination through experiences of humiliation, exclusion, or differential treatment based on family status. Children from lower status families might experience their social inferiority as personal inadequacy rather than structural inequality, creating self-esteem problems that could affect their entire life development. The gender role learning that occurred during medieval celebrations often involved exposure to extreme forms of gender inequality and sexual behaviour that could be traumatic for both boys and girls who were learning about adult social roles through observation of celebration activities. The sexual license that characterised many celebrations meant that children were exposed to adult sexual behaviour and gender dynamics that were inappropriate for their developmental stage. The religious trauma that children experienced during medieval celebrations included exposure to graphic depictions of torture, death, and divine punishment that were designed to inspire religious fear but could create lasting psychological disturbance for young people who lacked the cognitive sophistication to distinguish between religious symbolism and literal reality. Children might develop lasting fears about death, judgment, and divine punishment based on their celebration experiences. The peer relationships that children formed during medieval celebrations were often influenced by the competitive and hierarchical aspects of adult celebration culture, creating childhood social dynamics based on competition, exclusion, and status differentiation rather than cooperation and friendship. Children learned to relate to each other through the same power dynamics that characterized adult relationships, creating patterns that could affect their social development throughout their lives. The language and behavior that children learned during medieval celebrations often included exposure to profanity, sexual content, violent imagery, and various forms of inappropriate adult expression that could affect their linguistic and behavioral development in ways that parents and community members found problematic but couldn't control effectively. The celebration environment provided children with adult models of behavior that contradicted normal expectations for childhood conduct. The memory formation that occurred during medieval celebrations could create lasting psychological associations between social gathering and trauma, fear, or confusion that could affect children's ability to participate comfortably in social activities throughout their lives. Children who experienced trauma during celebrations might develop social anxiety, depression, or other psychological problems that persisted into adulthood and affected their ability to form healthy relationships and participate in community activities. Economic exploitation, the true cost of medieval fun. The economic structure of medieval celebrations represented a sophisticated system of wealth extraction that transferred resources from participants to hosts and various service providers through mechanisms that resembled modern predatory lending, or pyramid schemes more than genuine hospitality or community celebration. The true financial cost of participating in medieval celebrations often exceeded participants' ability to pay, creating debt and economic hardship that could persist for years after brief festive experiences. The mandatory gift-giving that characterized medieval celebrations wasn't voluntary expression of goodwill, but a complex system of tribute and social taxation that required participants to provide gifts appropriate to their social status and relationship to hosts, while competing with other guests to demonstrate appropriate generosity and respect. The social pressure to provide impressive gifts often motivated spending that exceeded participants' financial means, while providing hosts with substantial wealth transfers disguised as voluntary expressions of celebration spirit. The clothing requirements for medieval celebrations created ongoing financial pressure for families who needed to maintain wardrobes appropriate for various social occasions while lacking the income to support such expenses comfortably. The social necessity of appearing appropriately dressed at celebrations meant that families often went into debt to purchase clothing that would be worn rarely but judged constantly, creating financial obligations that could persist long after the celebrations that necessitated them. The accommodation costs associated with medieval celebrations extended beyond simple lodging fees to include various forms of payment for basic necessities that hosts could have provided as genuine hospitality but instead monetized as revenue opportunities. Guests might pay separately for bedding, heating, food storage, horse care, and various other services that created multiple revenue streams from single celebration events. The food and drink expenses at medieval celebrations were often structured as ongoing purchases rather than inclusive hospitality, with guests expected to pay for upgrades to basic provisions, additional quantities beyond minimal rations, and premium quality items that made the difference between barely adequate and actually satisfying consumption. The pricing structure encouraged continuous spending throughout celebrations while making it difficult to predict total costs in advance. The entertainment fees charged at medieval celebrations included payments to performers, contributions to prize funds for competitions, and various forms of participation costs that were presented as voluntary but were socially mandatory for guests who wanted to maintain appropriate celebration involvement. The cumulative cost of entertainment participation could exceed the original celebration expenses while being presented as optional additional enjoyment. The gambling activities that were central to medieval celebration culture represented systematic wealth transfer mechanisms that moved money from inexperienced participants to professional gamblers and hosts who controlled game rules and outcomes. The social pressure to participate in gambling activities meant that guests often lost significant amounts of money while attempting to maintain social standing through appropriate celebration behavior. The business transaction costs associated with medieval celebrations included fees for contract negotiation, legal documentation, witness services, and various other formal processes that were necessary for conducting the commercial activities that occurred during celebrations. The mixing of business and celebration activities created additional expense categories that participants might not anticipate when calculating celebration costs. The travel expenses required for medieval celebration attendance included not just transportation costs, but also various fees for road tolls, security services, guide services, and emergency assistance that could significantly increase the total cost of celebration participation. The seasonal timing of major celebrations often coincided with periods when travel was most expensive and dangerous, maximizing the cost of attendance. The religious obligations associated with medieval celebrations included charitable donations, church contributions, fees for special religious services, and various other spiritual expenses that were presented as voluntary expressions of piety but were socially mandatory for participants who wanted to maintain appropriate religious standing. The competitive aspects of religious giving at celebrations could motivate charitable donations that exceeded participants' financial capacity. The legal protection costs that prudent celebration participants needed to consider included fees for legal advice about contracts negotiated during celebrations, insurance against potential liability for celebration-related damages, and various forms of legal representation that might be necessary if celebration activities resulted in disputes or prosecution. The legal risks associated with celebration participation created additional expense categories that many participants didn't anticipate. The medical expenses that commonly resulted from medieval celebration participation included costs for treating injuries, illnesses, and various health problems that were predictable consequences of celebration activities, but were nonetheless treated as individual responsibility rather than systemic problems requiring host liability. The medical costs associated with celebration participation could exceed the original celebration expenses while being presented as unfortunate accidents rather than foreseeable consequences. The opportunity costs of medieval celebration participation included lost income from time away from productive work, missed business opportunities that occurred while attending celebrations, and various forms of economic activity that couldn't be pursued because of celebration obligations. The seasonal timing of major celebrations often conflicted with important economic activities, creating situations where celebration attendance required significant economic sacrifice. The debt service costs that followed medieval celebrations included interest payments on money borrowed to finance celebration participation, penalties for late payment of celebration-related debts, and various forms of ongoing financial obligation that could persist for months or years after brief celebration experiences. The credit arrangements available for celebration expenses were often predatory, with high interest rates and harsh penalties for default. The family financial impact of medieval celebrations extended beyond individual participant costs to affect entire household budgets. The celebration expenses often required reduction in other family expenditures, including food, clothing, housing, maintenance, and various forms of investment in family welfare and economic development. The family financial planning required for celebration participation could affect household economic stability and long-term financial prospects. The intergenerational financial effects of medieval celebrations included debt obligations that could be inherited by children, reduced family wealth that affected marriage prospects and economic opportunities for young people, and various forms of economic disadvantage that could persist through multiple generations as families struggled to recover from celebration-related financial damage. The community economic impact of medieval celebrations included disruption to local economic activity, inflation in prices for goods and services needed for celebrations, and various forms of economic distortion that could affect community economic stability and development. The concentration of economic activity during celebration periods could create boom and bust cycles that destabilized local economies while benefiting only a few service providers and hosts. Why medieval celebrations were nightmares, the inescapable truth. After examining every aspect of medieval celebration culture, from the mandatory attendance and elaborate preparation through the dangerous entertainment, violent aftermath, disease transmission, child trauma, and economic exploitation, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Medieval celebrations were carefully orchestrated disasters that combined religious obligation, social coercion, physical danger, and economic exploitation in a package that modern people would recognize as psychological torture disguised as community bonding. The fundamental problem with medieval celebrations was that they weren't voluntary social activities, but complex political and economic events that used festive atmospheres to mask coercive social control, wealth extraction, and various forms of exploitation that participants couldn't avoid without facing serious consequences for their social standing, economic prospects, and legal status. The holiday cheer was mandatory, the participation was enforced, and the enjoyment was performed rather than genuine. The physical dangers inherent in medieval celebrations would violate dozens of modern safety regulations and could result in criminal charges for anyone who organised events with such obvious risks to participants' health and safety. Food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, fire hazards, structural collapses, violence, and various forms of accident were predictable consequences rather than unfortunate surprises, creating celebration environments that were literally more dangerous than military battlefields. The psychological stress created by medieval celebration requirements would qualify as abuse by modern standards, as participants faced impossible social expectations, constant surveillance and judgment, economic pressure they couldn't afford, and physical demands that exceeded reasonable human endurance. The celebration atmosphere didn't reduce these stresses, but rather concentrated them into intensive experiences that could cause lasting psychological damage. The social coercion involved in medieval celebrations eliminated any possibility of genuine enjoyment or relaxation, as participants were required to perform appropriate behaviour, maintain correct social relationships, and demonstrate proper religious devotion, while simultaneously engaging in activities that contradicted their health, safety, and moral welfare. The contradiction between celebration requirements and human needs created cognitive dissonance that couldn't be resolved through participation. The economic exploitation built into medieval celebration culture systematically transferred wealth from participants to hosts and various service providers through mechanisms that resembled modern pyramid schemes or predatory lending practices, creating debt and financial hardship that could last for years after brief celebration experiences. The economic damage often exceeded any social or cultural benefits that participants might have gained from their involvement. The religious contradictions embedded in medieval celebrations created spiritual crises for participants who were required to violate Christian moral teachings during events that were supposedly conducted in honour of Christian holy days, creating conflicts between religious obligation and religious practice that couldn't be reconciled through theological reasoning or spiritual discipline. The religious framework provided justification for activities that violated religious principles. The legal vulnerabilities created by medieval celebrations left participants exposed to prosecution, civil lawsuits, and various forms of official retaliation for activities that were encouraged during celebrations but could be reinterpreted as criminal behavior when authorities found it convenient to pursue legal action. The legal ambiguity created a system where participation in celebrations could become evidence for prosecution rather than defense against accusations. The health consequences of medieval celebrations were both immediate and long-term, as participants faced disease transmission, food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, various forms of injury, and exposure to toxic substances that could cause permanent disability or death. The health risks weren't incidental to celebration activities, but were inherent in the practices that defined medieval festive culture, making safe participation virtually impossible. The gender inequality embedded in medieval celebrations created particularly dangerous situations for women who faced sexual harassment and assault in environments where normal social protections were suspended while remaining responsible for much of the labour that made celebrations possible. Women couldn't avoid participation without facing social and economic consequences, but participation exposed them to risks that they had limited ability to manage or escape. The class exploitation that characterized medieval celebrations used festive atmospheres to reinforce and justify social hierarchies that disadvantaged lower status participants while requiring their participation in events that primarily benefited social elites. The celebration format disguised wealth transfer and status reinforcement as community bonding and religious observance, making exploitation appear voluntary and even enjoyable. The violence that was endemic to medieval celebrations wasn't an unfortunate side effect, but was built into celebration activities through competitive events, alcohol consumption, weapons carrying, and various cultural practices that encouraged aggressive behaviour while providing inadequate mechanisms for conflict resolution or violence prevention. The celebration environment made violence more likely while making effective response to violence more difficult. The child exploitation that occurred during medieval celebrations exposed young people to physical dangers, psychological trauma, inappropriate adult content, and various forms of harm that could affect their development and well-being throughout their lives. Children were treated as miniature adults rather than as people with special developmental needs, creating celebration experiences that were often more harmful than beneficial for young participants. The disease transmission that occurred during medieval celebrations created epidemic patterns that could affect entire regions, as celebrations functioned as disease distribution centres where infectious illnesses spread from celebration sites throughout broader communities via the networks of social and economic connection that made celebrations possible. The public health consequences of celebrations often exceeded their social benefits by substantial margins. The aftermath problems created by medieval celebrations often caused more suffering than the celebrations themselves, as participants dealt with injuries, illness, debt, legal problems, social conflicts, and various other consequences that could affect their lives for months or years after brief celebration experiences. The recovery period from medieval celebrations was often longer and more difficult than the preparation period, creating negative cost-benefit ratios for most participants. So the next time you complain about modern holiday stress, dealing with family gatherings, gift-buying pressure, travel complications, or workplace holiday parties, remember that medieval celebration culture combined all of these modern annoyances with serious threats to life, health, freedom, and financial security. Your worst holiday experience probably caused less suffering than medieval people's best celebration memories. Modern celebrations, despite their commercial aspects and social pressures, operate within legal frameworks that protect participants' safety, health, and civil rights, while providing escape options for people who choose not to participate. Medieval celebrations offered none of these protections, while making participation essentially mandatory for anyone who wanted to maintain their place in society. Sleep well, knowing that your holiday celebrations involve voluntary participation in safe activities with people you choose to spend time with, consuming food that won't kill you, drinking alcohol that won't blind you, and engaging in entertainment that won't result in permanent injury or legal prosecution. Medieval people would have envied your most stressful holiday experiences more than they treasured their own celebration memories. The next time you're tempted to romanticize the past or wish for simpler times, remember that medieval celebrations represented the intersection of every human misery: poverty, disease, violence, coercion, exploitation, and death, wrapped in religious obligation and social requirement that made escape impossible and resistance punishable. Modern holiday commerce and social media pressure seem almost pleasant by comparison to celebration culture that could literally kill you for trying to have fun. Welcome to the modern world, where your biggest celebration worries involve finding parking at the mall, choosing appropriate gifts, and managing family dynamics rather than dying from food poisoning, being beaten to death in fights, or facing prosecution for heresy because you laughed at the wrong moment during religious ceremonies. It's not perfect, perfect, but compared to medieval celebrations, it's the closest thing to civilized enjoyment that human societies have ever achieved. Your freedom to decline party invitations, leave early when you're not enjoying yourself, eat food that meets safety standards, drink in moderation without social consequences, and celebrate in ways that align with your personal values represents centuries of social progress that liberated human enjoyment from the coercive frameworks that defined medieval celebration culture. The next time you exercise these freedoms, remember the medieval people who would have died grateful for the opportunity to experience your worst holiday complaints as their greatest celebration luxuries.